In the current session, we are going to discuss about the Docker network. So, when we create a Docker container, whether two containers can able to communicate each other by default or not. So, what types of Docker networks is available and we'll discuss now. So, Docker container and services are so powerful that itself take care of networking aspects so that the container can communicate with other containers, non-Docker applications, and also with the Docker host. When the Docker host run in Linux or Windows or mix of two, you can use Docker to manage them in a platform agnostic way. So now we see that what is the types of networks is available. User-defined bridge networks are the best when you need the multiple containers to communicate with on the same Docker host. And second network type is host networks are the best when the network stack should not be isolated from the Docker host, but you want other aspects of container to be isolated. And overlay networks are best when you need the containers running on the different hosts to communicate or when your multiple applications work together using the swarm services. And Mac plan networks are best when you are migrating from VM setup or need your containers to look like a physical host on your network, each with a unique MAC address. Third-party network plugins are allow you to integrate Docker with a specialized network stacks. So these are all the Docker network types. So now we'll see about these network types, how they are help to communicate with one container to other containers. I'll switch back to the command prompt to show demo on it. So what type of networks supported by Docker we can see here. When you give the docker info command, in that docker info it will use all the client informations and the server information, and in the server information you can see the plugins is these are all the networks supported in the Linux environment: bridge, host, IP VLAN, Mac VLAN, null, overlay. So by default, suppose if you don't mention any network type, by default it will take the bridge network. You can see here. So this is the default network which take by the containers. When you create the container, the bridge network will be the default network. Okay. So now we'll see in further. Now we'll see in further in the demo what is our goal in the demo. So what we do is we'll create two containers without specifying any network, and we'll try whether these containers are communicate by default or not. Meaning the communication between the container 1 and container 2 will be happening or not. And one more way is you will you will create the two containers with the bridge network, meaning you will create the network first and you will assign the containers to that particular network, so that way we can see. And also we will verify that whether custom bridge network containers can able to communicate with the default bridge network containers, meaning the first default bridge networks, right? I did not specify the network type assigned to the container. So it will take by default what is the network it will take default. And this is the one I will create a custom network and I will assign that network to these containers. So by right, these two will communicate since they are under the same network. So we will see in the demo. First we create the default bridge network, then we'll create the custom bridge network, and we'll verify whether the two are communicate or not. Okay. So I'll switch to the command prompt. and we'll see that is there any containers is running now. Docker ps. So some containers is running. So I'll just stop those containers. E1b CFO 8FC 036. So now we'll see that is the containers are removed or not. Yes, containers is stopped, and we'll see is there anything. Docker system room. So this command will help to remove all the stopped containers, all the networks not in use, all the images, all the build cache. Okay, so all those things has been cleared off. So now I'll go and see one more time. Is there any containers is running? Docker ps-a. So no container is running. Very good. Now we create a container using the nginx image. Docker run -rm name of the container is C1, and I will run this container using dit detached mode, and the image is nginx. So one container is created, and I'll create one more container called C2. So one more container is created. So now we verify that E3A, E5A. Okay, I'll open a notepad plus plus, and I will write down these container IDs. E3A, E3A is C1 container, and E5A is C2 container. Am I right? No. This is C2 and this is C1. Okay. Now inspect the C1. Docker inspect C1, the container ID. See here, when I create the container C1, Docker inspect, it will give all the information. The inspect command will give all the lower information. So the state of the container, it is running, and you can go and see. I'm interested in see the networks part. So in the networks, by default it was taken the bridge network, and the IP address being assigned to the container. So it is similar like a virtual machine. So the what is the container we opened now is C1. Docker inspect C1. So IP address is for C1, IP address is 172.17.0.2. I'll show you why we use this IP address. So next, use CLS docker inspect C2, and this also taken a default network is bridge network, and you can see that 172.17.0.3. so this is the IP address. So now what I want to try now, is I want to go to the interactive mode for the C1. I want to ping the C2 from there, whether I can communicate the from C1 to C2. Okay. So what I will do is docker exec -it -it, and what is the container ID for the C1? So that's the reason I have noted all these information. So E5A and SH. So now I have entered into the container C1. So ls, it will give you all those Docker directory information. Now I'll ping the C2 IP address. So this is the C2 IP address. I'll just ping it. So it shows the error is ping not found. So in this container, the ping is not installed. So I'm going to install that apt get update. So this is the command to install the ping. So just remember that and done. And one more command, apt get install ip utils ping. So it's going to install the ping now in the container C1. So it's done. Now what I am going to do is ping and get the IP address of C2. Perfect. Now what it was doing is from C1 I can able to communicate to C2 using the IP address. So when I pass C2 IP address, the communication is successful. But I'll show you one more thing. But when I pass using the container name, for example, C2, ping C2, it will not work because it cannot able to identify using the container name. So name or service is not known. So what in this example, what we have done is when you create a container with default network, bridge network, so by default it will take a bridge network, the two containers able to communicate by default, meaning you no need to make any network mapping or anything. It using of their IP address, they can able to communicate instead of their name of the container. It will not possible to communicate, but using of IP address it is possible to communicate. So this is the one example. I will open now one more window. Okay, let's open one more window. So now what I want to do is I want to create another images -rm name equal to C3. So 1 minute. Before we going to create that, so in the previous example, what we did is we created two containers with default network. So in this example, what I am going to do is I am going to create a custom network and assigning that network to the containers. So that is what we need to try the second example. So for that, what I am going to do is docker create network create. So driver bridge network. I am going to create a custom bridge network. So my custom dot net. So this is the network name I am creating. So if we see in this example, what we tried in the first example is we created two containers under default bridge network, and we have seen that these two containers able to communicate with using of their IP address. Now we are trying this example. I'm going to create a custom bridge network. I'm going to assign this network to these two containers, and I'm going to try whether these containers able to communicate or not. So for that, I'm going to switch to the second window. So for this, I have written a command docker. This is the command to create the network, custom network. Docker network create hyphen hyphen driver, and you mention this here is the type of the network. So I'm going to create the bridge network. So bridge network. The name of the network is mycustom.net. So now you can see that whether network is created or not. Docker network ls. Where is the network? So this is the network is just created. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a container, create the container C3 and assigning the network is the my custom net nginx. So what I am doing now, you see the difference. What we done before is, before we did not mention this network, the previous example. But in this example, we created a custom network and we are assigning that network to this container. And I'm going to do one more is C4. So how many containers we have created is 1, 2 containers under the custom network. So now use CLS and Docker PS. So you might see that 4 containers is running currently. C1, C2 under default network. C3, C4 is under custom network. So now I want to try that whether C3, C4 able to communicate or not. Obviously. So but we'll see that whether they are communicate or not. So for that what I can do is Docker exec it and what is the container. So I'm going to take into the C3 083 sh and I was enter into this container and you can see all the directories. Then I'm going to ping the, okay, 1 minute. What I need to do before I need to ping that, I need to get IP address of C4. So for that what I will do is docker inspect C3 and you can get the IP address is 192. So then open this C3, the IP address is 172.19.0.2. So this is the IP address. So same way I have to get IP address of C4. So docker inspect C4 and IP address is C4 IP address is 172.19.0.3. So this is the C3 IP address and you can see that what is the container names is 083 will be C083 will be the C3, 02C will be the C4. Perfect. So just remember why I am giving these details is to make clear everything. So CLS, sorry, CLS. So now what I want to do is I want to enter interactive mode into the C3. So IT, then what is my container ID of C3083. 083 sh. So I enter into that. So I'm going to do ping and copy the C4 IP address and paste here. Now you'll get the error because ping is not installed. So I'm going to install same steps what we done previously. App get update and once it is done, apt get install IP utils ping. So it is going to install the ping in under C3. Now what I want to do is ping and copy the C4 IP address. So able to communicate. So I will call this as a E5A. So this is the C1. This is the C1 tab. And I will take this as a C3 tab. Okay. So now what I want to do is, so now what we observed is from C1 to C2 communication is successful and from C3 to C4 communication is successful. So that's what we have seen in the current demo. So now what I want to try is from C1 to C3 I will try. So ping C3. By right it will not work because the network it is there. C1 is under default network and the network under there in the C3 is in the custom network. So they cannot communicate each other because by default network container to default network container communication is successful. By default custom network to custom network container communication is successful. But from default network to the custom network it is not possible and it is correct. So how we can make the C1 can communicate with C3. So what I am going to do now is exit, or I will open one more CMD. So take the path and I'm going to add this C1 container into the custom network. So meaning the C1 will be there in under default network as well as the custom network. So Docker network connect my custom net C1. See, communication is started. You can see this window. The communication is started already between C3 and the C1. Why? Because of C1 already added into the custom network. So I can show you Docker inspect my custom network. See now how many containers is there under my custom network. Custom network is 3 containers is there. So what are all these containers? You can see that the first container is 02C meaning C4 and second container is 083 meaning C3 and third container is E5. So meaning C1. That's the reason it can able to communicate, C1 able to communicate with C3, because the C1 is there in the default network and the custom network. I'll show you that one as well. CLS. I'll just stop this communication. So Docker inspect C1 and go to the networks. So it was there under the default bridge network as well as under my custom network. So C1 is now under both networks. So that's the reason it can able to communicate with C2 and it can able to communicate with C3 and C4. So that's the how you implemented communication between default network and the custom network. So that's all about the Docker networks.